Well, I'm very, very, very excited to be chatting today on my little Zoom chats with Phill Brown. And I must confess that I only actually met with Phill on Facebook in recent times. But it turns out he has been involved in quite a few of my very, very favourite records. Which, in fact, there's a couple that are so special to me that I'm blown away that they are linked in some way by one person, and that would be you, Phill. And I'll hold them up. I've got my much treasured compact discs here with me. One of them is One World by John Martyn, the late and very great John Martyn. A magical record that has been a part of my life for 15 years or so. And then this one, Laughing Stock by Talk Talk, which I think is, I'll go so far as to say, the sort of summit of 20th century music, because it's built on almost everything that came before. It somehow gathers so much from blues to modern classical to rock to jazz, and it's perfect. So I can't wait to talk to you, Phill. Thank you for your time today. But the other thing that Phill has done is he's become an author and written an amazing account of his career called Are We Still Rolling? And it's a wonderful book you can get from Amazon or indeed, I think, Phill, do you sell them yourself?
No, it's quite tricky because I can't get hold of the books myself from the publishers anymore. So there's a talking book version, but it's easier to go to Amazon and either get a digital download, the talking book, or the paperback, as long as it's in print.
Yeah, which I did. And I came across you through my friend Tim Rennick.
Tim.
So so Tim, the amazing guitar player, session guitarist, who I believe actually you made an album with under his own name back in the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, I worked with him a lot in the 70s as a session player, as you say. And then in the 80s, I was involved with Murray Head, who's an English singer, but he's basically known in France, really, I suppose, for this Sailor and Sojo, a record he had in the 70s on Ireland, which was very successful. And Tim was part of that band in the 80s. And then I worked with Tim and Tim Cross and the guy from the Adverts, TV Smith, and we did an album back in the 80s with those three. I've not seen Tim for years because went off with Floyd, I think, and moved to the West Country, and so we haven't connected up. But he's a sweetheart, great guitar player, and just a lovely guy.
He's another of my heroes who I sort of first came across through Pink Floyd and watching Pulse, their live album and video, almost on repeat as a teenager, and there he was playing alongside David Gilmour and David handing him lead parts, and then found him on albums such as A Single Man by Elton John, which I grew up listening to in my parents' car, and then also loved his work on Richard Wright's solo album, Broken China. So I got to know him through my friend Tom, who builds guitars, who I got to know, and he built a guitar for Tim, and we met up in Guildford once, and just an amazing guy. So yes, he actually was mentioned, I think, in your chapter, an amazing chapter, I must add, on Dana Gillespie. I saw his name come up.
Yeah.
That is one of my favourite chapters in this book, I must say.
Yeah,
so let's go. Sorry.
Really drugs and rock and roll with Dana Gillespie. I mean, it's just kind of wild era.
Yeah, it is a wild chapter. So let's go back to the start of the book. On the front it says studios, drugs and rock and roll. And I must say, it delivers on all of those, and a breathtaking amount of drugs referenced in the book. And that's almost just an aside, actually. But I must say, your writing about all of your experiences is so warm. Very warm. It's very readable. And you start the book with your first job at Olympic Studios. And the track I want to pick up on, which I was amazed that you were sort of there, is All Along the Watchtower. So Jimi Hendrix's version of the Bob Dylan song. So tell us a bit about your memories of being
right. Well,
there.
I was stripping down a string session that we'd been doing in the evening at Olympic Studio 1. I was a tape op at the time. And we got a phone call, quite late in the evening, probably around 11, because the strings didn't finish till 10. And it was Eddie Kramer, and just wanted to know if there was anyone in the studio at the time. And I explained, we're just finishing up. And he said, right, we're on our way down. And it turns out that Hendrix and Eddie and Mitch Mitchell were at a party. And obviously they just suddenly decided they'd love to record that song. And, in that era, I think you get that from the book as well. You could do things very fast. Now you'd have to get managers and permission. But back then, so they just turned up. And Noel Redding, who wrote in his book, he said, everyone was pissed. I didn't think it was going to get anything. So he never bothered coming. So Dave Mason turned up with him from Traffic. And Dave played the acoustic guitar, Hendrix played bass, and Mitch Mitchell played the drums. And we put down, because I set it up with Eddie, and then George Skiantz, who was the usual, that guy is another, a gem he was a tape op technically, but was technically amazing. He was the one who helped build those pedals with Roger Meyer. So he'd go and hang out with Hendrix, and Hendrix would describe things in a kind of, not in a technical way. He'd say, I want something that kind of, turns inside out. And then he and Roger Mayer would go away and tinker and come up with some pedal. So George was, phoned, I guess, at some point and told to turn up. But until he did, I was the guy that kind of set it up and started. It was on a 4-track machine. Again, it seems absurd. So we did drums on 1 track, which was the norm, bass on 1 track, acoustic guitar, so that's the 3 of them. And then we double tracked the acoustic guitar. And at that point, I think George arrived. So I left. And they then we used to copy 4-track to 4-track. And I guess maybe a week or 10 days later, Eddie asked me to go in and help him with some guitar overdubs because George wasn't available or something. So I was in there when Hendrix did the electric guitars and all that panning in the middle and everything. It's a weird track, that, because I was 17 years old just, and it was the sound in Studio 1 at Olympic was brilliant through these big tannoys in Lockwood, this tiny little homemade desk, 4-track, but it stuck with me for some reason. The sound of it, the vibe, that way of working, being very spontaneous and just going for things. And if it didn't work, you tried something else. No one there wasn't like egos or problems with that. So that track has strangely stuck with me. But Olympic was just an amazing experience. The year and a bit that I spent there, I mainly worked with Glyn Johns, but the albums that we worked on, it was, for training purposes, it was just phenomenal,
I looked up a little earlier, and I'm just recalling it here. The streams on Spotify for All Along the Watchtower are standing currently at 335,624,535. So, it's his most popular song on Spotify.
Wow.
And he's got 7.5 million monthly listeners. So it's fair to say that I've heard a lot of covers of All Along the Watchtower, and nearly all of them have been covers of the Jimi Hendrix cover.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say that it's a pillar of our sort of rock and roll culture, that song, and to be there when it was recorded, it must have been.
Well, I've always considered myself lucky, in being at the right place, right time, bumping into people and things like that. You've just spent all day doing a straight kind of string session, probably with Keith Grant, and you're stripping things down, and then suddenly you get this phone call, which allows you to witness something like that, And I mean, that whole year at Olympic with, we did Beggar's Banquet and Ogden's Nut Gone Flake with the Small Faces, The Move, Steve Miller Band. I mean, it was phenomenal education. And also with very little technology, which, I mean, although we have so much now, I kind of really, I'm so thankful that I learned when there was so little, because you had to use, in a way, the right mic. You had to get sounds in the room that you wanted rather than recording anything and sorting it out later. So much was done in a live environment, and all through the 70s. And I just think I was incredibly lucky,
Yeah, that's quite a baptism into your career, isn't it? With these artists coming through. I mean, there's the Small Faces. Probably, I'd still say quite an underrated band.
Marriott, definitely. I mean, what a singer! He was such a fantastic singer. And a lovely guy. I mean, I actually worked with him as the engineer in Studio 2 on the day that he got married. He'd got married in a registry office and then turned up at the studio because he wanted to put a vocal on something. So I'm sitting there with, he's all, in smart hippie clothes, his new wife. And we're in Studio 2 and we did a vocal on one of, not on Ogden, it was up way after that, on some other track. But he was a lovely guy and a great singer, and I think totally underrated.
Well, I was listening to 78 last night a little bit, because actually another friend of mine, Sam Brown, I think actually that was her first session.
Was it really?
Wow. She was still a teenager, but obviously being Joe and Vicky's daughter.
Yeah, I worked a lot with Vicky.
Yeah, I've seen her mentioned in the book as well, and it's and obviously you got a chapter on Joe.
Yeah.
So it's amazing that how these various circles cross. Yeah. It makes me very proud still to sort of be British and to be even on the very, very outer circles of the folk that were involved, to actually call Sam a friend and Tim and to get to know yourself and a few others. It's like touching magic for me. It's like there's a community to it all that when you start digging into sort of the rock and roll family history, you see all these relationships, people cross over, and
And I think it also with you kind of make friends, don't you, with people that are pretty easygoing or chilled, So I guess you mentioned 3 people there who I got on really well with, but it's partly because we're all fairly laid back. I don't think there's Tim. I never saw any real ego with Tim, and so on. So I think it's that thing of there's a good bunch of people out there, and I say it is a very British aspect, I think.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a few occasions where you talk about being in America and being in New York, for example, in the Dana Gillespie chapter, and it's a very different atmosphere, and it's fast, but there's this sort of enclaves of Britishness where you've got Mick Jagger and yourself, and Dana and Angie Bowie.
Yeah, wonderful.
Sat round together for sort of an evening meal at the apartment in New York before you go out for a big night out. So it's a very vivid book. I can read this and I'm transported into my mind's eye, I guess.
Good.
So let's yes, you mentioned the Rolling Stones and Beggar's Banquet. In some ways quite an acoustic album, that one.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of slide guitar from Brian Jones.
I mean, Brian, I think he's also come out of it all, as this kind of lost figure. I don't think he's been treated particularly well. There's a documentary that's just about to be released, I think, on Brian. But he was a fantastic musician. He could pick up any instrument and and get a sound out of it, you know. And he was in a bad way on Beggars Banquet. And a lot of people just kind of, you know, didn't really talk to him or deal with him, you know. And then he does some amazing slide guitar on, I think it's Parachute Woman or something. And it's just like, the guy, you know, it was a pity because about 6 months after that, he was dead, you know. So, and so different, you know, you got Bill Wyman, who was very, very quiet. Charlie, who was great fun in those days, but also just, you know, out for a bit of a laugh and, you know, different. And then on the other camp, you had kind of Jagger and Richards, who were a different kind of thing entirely. I did something in the early 90s, I mixed a track for Jagger. And I think I said in Dana's thing, I mean, he's a real chameleon, you know, he adjusts very much his personality for the people that he's with. But with Brian, I mean, he was, you know, he was what you saw, really. I mean, I know that there's a side to him that was quite dark, and he could be very aggressive, especially as his health and drugs and everything took over. But he was, you know, he was very cool on Beggars Banquet, but I think somewhat has been written out of the story in a way with the Stones.
Yeah, I've heard sort of from some sources that it was kind of Jagger and Richards muscling him out a bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've got to remember that it was in a way, it was Brian's band originally. You know, he had this band that Jagger joined. Then Jagger and Richards, because they were the songwriters, in a way took over the band, which is fair enough. I mean, most singers or singer-songwriters do. And then they sack him, you know, at the end. So I just always felt sorry for Brian, really. I think if he'd had some better people around him and chose more wisely some of the friends that he had, he might still be here. But he just went off on that terrible decline.
And of course, you know, we get into this amazing partnership that you had for about 10 years with Island Records and working on staff with Island. And you know, I was watching recently a documentary about Island Records made, I think, about 10 years ago, when they celebrated 50 years. And just sort of listening to Chris Blackwell and his story. And now I'm talking to somebody that was there, and this amazing burgeoning pink label, they called it in the 60s, didn't they? And this underground scene that was kind of coalescing around a record label. And they built this studio complex at Basing Street, which you became a member of staff at. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. No, I joined in June of 1970. I think the studios had been built towards the end of '69 into the spring of '70. Studio 2 was open when I joined. Studio 1 was still being finished off. But Blackwell is one of the most remarkable characters, I think, to run a record label. He's not like a typical record label boss, you know. And Island changed drastically over the years, but that early period, I mean, I was a house engineer for about 6 years. And the first 2 or 3 years were phenomenal. The whole place was run, the record label only had about 8 people upstairs running it. There were 4 very feisty women that ran it. Sally Whiteman, who I married, Denise Mills, and was it Susan Humphreys, I think? But, you know, it was amazing setup there, and you could get things done very easily because, you know, Guy Stevens was A&R, who went up, he also produced records, but you could literally go up the spiral staircase to the Island offices and suggest something or ask for something, and you'd get an instant reply. You know, now from my experience, I mean, I've stopped dealing with it all, but when you phone record companies now to get through to an A&R department, you get an answer machine. You know, that's kind of where we are now. But it was an amazing, I mean, it followed on brilliantly from the Olympic era. I mean, in fact, he stole, in a way, Chris did steal a lot of the people that worked at Olympic. Frank Owen, the maintenance guys, you know, he took Dick Swetnam, who built the original Olympic desk, and gave him the money to set up Helios Electronics so that he could, you know, we had the first 2 Helios at Island. But yeah, it was like well, I think I said in the book, it's like a 24-hour party at one point for about 2 years. And because there was such a friendly and a family vibe about it all, you might come down at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to grab a cup of tea or something, and Winwood and Capaldi or Chris Wood, even Kossoff, people would just be hanging out downstairs. They weren't on sessions, they were just there, pick up a bit of ganja, have a cup of tea, and you could get hold of these people and say, if you've got 10 minutes to come and do an organ, and Winwood would, come and play. Capaldi played on all kinds of things, which he would never have probably played on. You had to go through managers and all of that, So it was the fact that there was so many people just hanging out in the building that all added to this creative kind of vibe there. It was absolutely brilliant.
And so some of the artists you worked with actually at Olympic were island artists, like Traffic.
I think Spooky Tooth. I don't know if Joe Cocker was on Ireland at that point, but Spooky Tooth definitely, and Traffic. I worked on the end of the Mr. Fantasy album and then most of the second Traffic album, and did a few bits and pieces at Ireland, but not very much with Traffic. I worked with Steve Winwood on a solo project, and I worked with Capaldi a lot on solo stuff. But yeah, there was this real hangover from Olympic into Ireland.
And then a band come along from Jamaica, and they are obviously fronted by somebody that would go on to sort of be regarded as a legend and an icon. A band called the Wailers.
Yeah.
And you got to work on their second album.
The Burning album. What they used to do is, Catch a Fire was done the same. They were recording on an 8-track machine in Kingston in Jamaica, and then Black would bring the tapes over, and we would copy them to the new 16-track machine that we had, so that we had tracks left to add extra instruments, in a way to make it more accessible, I suppose, to a wider audience. Mm-hmm. You take this kind of roots reggae. I mean, it's why Pete Tosh, I think it was, he left the band pretty soon after the Burning album, because we sped up the tracks to make them a lot more accessible than this kind of slower roots reggae. And you can speed up music quite easily, but you can't speed up vocals. So we would, put it onto the 16-track, speed it up, and then Bob would redo the vocals, so it didn't sound Mickey Mouse. Yeah. It's partly because at Ireland, I suppose, although we worked on a vast array of different styles of music, but I was doing a lot of reggae for Trojan. I mixed a lot of stuff for Jimmy Cliff, and then, the Bob Marley thing followed on. So,
because Jimmy Cliff was Blackwell's first idea of somebody that could be like a breakthrough reggae artist to the white audience, but it just didn't quite happen. But then I suppose it really did catch on that much more with Bob Marley and the Wailers. And I think I read somewhere that it was partly to do with Blackwell saying, look, reggae could be the black rock and roll, but you need to put a bit more guitar solo stuff in, which is why there's so much guitar sort of on Bob Marley and the Wailers stuff compared to a lot of other reggae that was being made at the time.
Well, yeah, and that was very different, partly because of these extra little touches of guitar, extra little bits of keyboard, things that were done to, say, make it more commercial, I suppose is a word. And the speeding up was probably quite an important factor as well. But I mean, Jimmy Cliff had some great records, Many Rivers to Cross, and there were some great tracks there. And Blackwell made that film with him as well, didn't he? There was a movie that Jimmy was in. But I mean, Blackwell is, white Jamaican, and he lived out there, and he totally understood the music and loved all that. So he, with the label, when you think he's got people like Traffic and Spooky Tooth and a lot of kind of rock stuff free, he just wanted to get, this Jamaican music out to a wider audience, which he obviously succeeded in doing, and they were tough characters, the Wailers. You know, they were street kids from Trenchtown in a way. They weren't gentle souls. You know, they were tough guys. You know, so I mean, I think I mentioned, but I couldn't understand a word they said for the first week I was around them. You know, because they spoke in this patois, which I mean, and Chris, you know, very white. I think he went to Eton, but very white, upper class kind of character, would just fall into that way of speaking, and you know, he became like the sixth member in a way. But it was, you know, an amazing an experience. But also, you see, the thing that I'm asked so many times about is that, like Hendrix, although he was fairly successful at the time, I never thought that, you know, I mean, there was something special about Bob. I would totally say that, you know, I thought he was some kind of prophet. You know, there was something about him that was quite amazing. But when you're working on records, you can't always tell whether it's going to be a massive success or a failure or what. You know, that then wasn't really, it didn't really interest me, to be honest. I worked on so many things that were great records but were failures, you know, but it wasn't what you were doing it for. You know, it's so brilliant when you get a #1 record, you know, but it's only ego in a sense. You kind of, you know.
And it's funny, isn't it, sitting at this vantage point, 2020, and looking back and just seeing, like I referred to Bob Marley as an icon, and you sort of worked and knew him way before there was that sort of that status attached to him. And I think sometimes it's in sort of it's post I want to say after death, you know, that people are sort of venerated in this way. But you know, you rub shoulders with these guys. One of my favorite stories is when I don't want to give too much of the book away. People should buy it and read it. But one of my favorite stories I will touch on just now is where you are editing I Shot the Sheriff, and you've been given this massive spliff, and one of the seeds or something has popped.
Yeah, the whole thing just disintegrated. It was Steve Smith, who was an American from Muscle Shoals, Alabama, but he worked at Muscle Shoals, and we did a lot of stuff together in the 70s with Robert Palmer and Lennon's backing band. But he used to call them baseball bats. You know, they were big coned joints and neat grass. And family man Barrett gave me it, and you know, we all smoked a lot back then. I'd never really smoked the tape machine, I suppose, but on this occasion, for some reason, I was. And I'd done the first part of the edit, and I was just, you know, I was about to cut to where we were going to, you know, the bit we were getting rid of. And the whole thing just kind of fell apart, really. I mean, it wasn't so much one seed popping as this kind of, you know, ½ inch of stuff. And it just fell in slow motion and melted, because it doesn't burn tape really, but it melted the tape. So instead of 2 inches, it was like ½ inch. And fortunately, I just got rid of everyone out of the room. When I was given that, I said, well, look, give us 10 minutes. Because, you know, Studio 2 was a small room. So when you got kind of 5 guys in there, plus Chris, and, you know, you want to concentrate, and it's horrible having people, you know, looking over your shoulder when you're doing a 2-inch edit. So they'd left the room, thank goodness. And I was there with the assistant on my own. But I salvaged it. You know, no one ever knew about it. In fact, until early 90s, Julian Mendelsohn, who was an engineer that worked for Trevor Horn, he phoned me up one day and said, so what's the story with the edit? And I was like, you know, what edit? What story? He goes, come on. He said, I've just got the Bob Marley tapes out. I think they were probably doing a remix of something for anniversary of his death or his birth or something. And he said, I Shot the Sheriff. He said, that's no ordinary edit. He could tell, yeah, that he could tell just by the, you know, the amount of sticky tape and the fact that it just didn't look right to him. But you couldn't hear it. That was the main thing. I mean, I never heard it on vinyl. I can pick up on it when it was digitally re-released and was cleaner, and the brighter you make it, the more you're likely to hear it. I think it's the second or third drum beat, you know, that when you know, that's where the edit is. But yeah, I got away with it. No one ever knew for 20 years.
Brilliant. And then to continue on this topic, one of my favorite live albums, you taped.
It was fantastic.
Did you mix it?
I mixed it. Yeah, it was. At Island, I mean, that's why I'm burning. I did a lot of the sessions, but Tony Platt also did a lot of the sessions. We were where you think nowadays you get a project and you see it through to the end, or it might be mixed by somebody else. But in those days, all us house engineers, we were just on a rota of work. So I might do a week with Bob Marley, and then Tony would do a week with Bob Marley, and then maybe Phil Alt. You know, it was very odd the way they did it in a way. And you'd be put on something else, which they thought maybe it was, you know, more important. So I was working with Robert Palmer with Steve Smith, and I think about a year before we'd gone up to Leeds because Chris wanted to get a live Bob Marley album, and we'd gone up to Leeds in kind of November with the Island Mobile, and it was a wickedly cold time, and the wind was howling through there. And Bob came off stage afterwards and went, too cold. And they all flew back to Jamaica. So we never got the album, you know. And then you fast forward like 7 or 8 months, and Steve and I were at Ireland working with Palmer, and Chris and Steve said, weren't you doing some, you know, Bob Marley recordings? And I mean, oh yeah. Because, you know, he's on tour now. So it was Steve Smith that actually phoned Blackwell and said, why don't we record the Lyceum gigs? So I went down there and helped set it all up with Steve, but I wasn't there for the actual night of recording because I got sent back to carry on working with Robert Palmer. And then that was a Thursday and a Friday, I think, the 2 nights. First night was a disaster because the audience invaded the stage. So most of it's the second night. And then on the Sunday, Blackwell called me in and we mixed it. And I still cannot believe this myself. We mixed the whole album in 6 hours.
Wow.
Because all he was interested in doing was capturing the atmosphere. And it was on 16 tracks, so it's not as if you're dealing with 40, 100 tracks. So and it's manual. It's all manual in those days.
I think that's one of the reasons I love it, is the atmosphere.
Yeah. That, again, is down to Chris, because he kept saying, you know, I'd get a mix up, and he kept saying more audience. And obviously, when you bring the audience mic up, you bring up the PA. Unfortunately, the PA, you know, was a good mix. But each time I brought it up a few dB, it kind of changed my mix, you know. So you'd compensate, and then Chris would just kept saying more audience, and eventually he got it to a certain point. He went, great, run it off like that. And this is another thing that's hard to believe. We've been setting up something like Trenchtown Rock, which is in the middle of the set, and we then spooled back to the top of the concert, reel 1, and ran it off, you know, manually kind of mixing it as you went. Reel 1, reel 2, reel 3, you know. We didn't even put down the mix that we just set up. That was a template. We went back and put it down like that. A couple of crossfades and edits on 1/4 inch, and 6.5 hours later, it's all finished.
Amazing. The version of No Woman, No Cry. Yeah. Well, I think that's the definitive version.
It is fantastic, and I really concern me that there's feedback in it, you know, because it feeds back in the PA.
Yes, it does. I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, well, that was something that happened in the PA, but because we had our mics, you know, having so much audience up there, we obviously got that. And at the time, it really concerned me. And now, when I listen to that record, I'm just waiting for that moment. I think it's fantastic. It's so, you know, it's so live.
It is. It's right, and it takes you there, because it's not like this. Completely over the top polished thing. It's this vibe, and it's so infectious. I mean, I had it on earlier, and we were grooving. Me and my kids were grooving around to it. That guitar solo has always been one of my favorite guitar solos. It just keeps getting better, that guitar solo. So I love that, and it's amazing that I get to talk to you who mixed it.
No, it was great fun to do. I mean, it's fast again because we just did 2 nights recording, and you know, with some overdubs to repair the backing vocals on the Sunday. We did about 10 hours on the Sunday, and it's done. You know, and it was out in the shops. You could buy it within 3 weeks, I think. You know, that was another thing that was very exciting at the time. You do something and it would be out. Whereas it wasn't like it started in the 80s, but it's got really bad since about 2000, where you do something and maybe 6 months or a year later, this album comes out, and everyone's moved on from then, you know, so the band have to go out and perform an album that's a year old, and they've written all new songs, so they want to do another, you know, they've moved on. It's just the way record companies started to work from, you know, from the 80s onwards, really.
Yeah, it's particularly bad now for somebody doing sort of independent level music, because to get any hope of being found by the curators of the Spotify playlists, which is kind of like the new radio. If you get selected by an official Spotify playlist, you're going to get, you know, hundreds of thousands of streams, not just hundreds or thousands. But the backlog is about 3 months long, and it keeps getting longer. So you've got to upload your track and then give a lead-in time of 3 or 4 months to have the chance of being picked up. Some dude sat with his computer working through all the submissions, deciding if it's good enough for a Spotify playlist. That's what you've got to do now. So, you know, it's similar now, I think, for...
So you can totally grasp why I say kind of 60s and 70s for me was such a great era, because everything was so fast.
Yeah.
You know, you worked fast, you could get hold of people, and things came out fast. So it was exciting. I drifted in the 80s for a start. I just found the 80s tedious.
Well, we'll come on to the 80s, but let's quickly mention some of the guys that you worked with in the 70s. So you did quite a lot with Robert Palmer, a couple of albums with Robert Palmer.
Yeah, I did 4 in all.
4.
Yeah. The fourth one, as you were saying earlier about New York, the fourth one was, a lot of that was initially done in New York, and it was a very different experience to any of the others we did. But the first one is the Meters with Lowell George. Second one was most of Little Feat, and then a lot of the Motown guys. I mean, for me, again, what a dream, you know, to work with your heroes. And I mean, that came about, again, through chance. Robert and I were down here at my house. We were doing overdubs on Sneaking Sally Through the Alley, which is the first album. We had the Island Mobile parked outside, and we were doing overdubs. And later that night, he and I just were making up lists of our heroes, you know, drummers, bass players, and so on. And in the morning, Steve Smith, who was producing it, saw this list, said, "What's this?" You know, he said, "Oh, it's a bit of fun, you know, it's our heroes." And he said, "Can I borrow it?" And he took the list, unbeknown to us, you know, he's a real American hustler in a way. And he just spent a couple of weeks on the phone, and then came back to Robert and I and said, "Right, we're in Baltimore with the Little Feat, you know, in May or whenever it was, you know, and then we're in Muscle Shoals with the Muscle Shoals guys, and then we're in LA, you know," and we ended up over those first 3 albums working with all these heroes of ours, you know, the Motown guys, James Jamerson and Carol Kay. So, I mean, again, what a trip, you know, out of something that was just a bit of fun.
So I talk music with a few engineers I've worked with, and the regard for Little Feat is so high still.
Amazing.
You know, the Feats Don't Fail Me Now, and sort of the albums of the mid 70s, and they've just got this groove, and you can hear that when I listen to Pressure Drop.
Yeah,
you've got that sound.
But you see, the thing is, they just finished Feats Don't Fail Me Now. They were in Baltimore doing it, and they just stayed. They said they'd stay at the studio for an extra 5 days. So they'd mixed their album, they'd recorded, mixed it, they were ready to go home. And they said, "We'll stay." We went over there. So we're in the same room as Feats Don't Fail Me Now, with the same desk. Obviously, I had different setup to them. But that's when we caught them, right at the end of Feats Don't Fail Me Now.
So they'd been warming up for you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we cut the album. I mean, we cut it so fast. I mean, and again, in those days, and this sounds really extreme, but we cut the album, the whole album, with Little Feat, and then we went down to Muscle Shoals and we cut the whole album again with the Muscle Shoals guys, and then we went to LA and cut a lot of the tracks again with a different setup, and then came back to England again, got the Island Mobile, and listened through to all the versions and stuff, and decided which, most of it was Little Feat, but decided, you know, kind of which version we wanted to go with.
Wow.
The freedom, and I say, and the kind of really trying to capture something, that's all we were about in those days, really.
Yeah, and I'm guessing there must be, if there isn't already, there must be a very exciting expanded edition of that album that could be released
It
based
could
on
be, yeah, if the tapes still survive, because there's been this huge fire in the Universal, I think it is, warehouse where a lot of tapes were kept. Because Universal in the 80s and 90s bought up every other label. Island got sold to them, A&M, everyone got sold to Universal. So whether the tapes still survive, I have no idea. But in theory, there's a whole other albums worth of material, alternative versions at least.
And I'm imagining just eye-watering amounts of money.
They were expensive albums, mate. I mean, Robert never recouped on the first 3 albums. We didn't have a hit until the 4th album with It Takes Every Kind of People. That was the first hit we had. So the first 3 albums were failures. But Chris loved the albums, and this is again back to Blackwell. He loved what we were doing. He loved Robert. He loved the records. And it was, instead of it being one of these, well, I'm not sure we can continue, he just, when Sneaking Sally didn't happen, he couldn't go and make another one, which is why we did Pressure Drop. When Pressure Drop didn't happen, well, let's do a third, So Chris was always going to stick, with this team, because, 3 of us did 3 albums. And he believed in Robert. I mean, eventually Robert, got through and it worked. But Sneaking Sally for me is such a great album. I mean, I have such a kind of emotional contact with it because of how the tracks were put down, but also doing overdubs at my house. And we had to mix manually, obviously all through the 70s, most of those mixes are manual mixes. And it was exciting and it was fun. I mean, you do a mix. Robert used to wear a T-shirt that said more bass. And at Island, you sat at the back, as it were, with a wall behind you, and all the seating was in front. And every so often he would just stand up with his T-shirt, more bass. And when you did a mix and you got the fade out as well, people in the room, because we always worked with loads of people in the room, they'd applaud. I mean, it was just a fantastic, positive environment to work in. So I love those records. I mean, Robert was such a lovely guy, brilliant.
Mm. The chance you had to work with various voices. I'm thinking of, obviously Robert Palmer and Steve Marriott, but you also worked quite a few times with both in Traffic and then as a solo artist, Steve Winwood, another huge hero of mine. I particularly Arc of a Diver, probably my favorite of his solo records. I love the 80s stuff.
Yeah, it just changed, isn't it? I mean, for me, the 80s, it wasn't what I expected from Steve, I suppose, in the 80s. It all became a bit more kind of pop and production. Whereas, he was never about that in the past. But he was, he was my hero. He's only a year older than me. So when I was 17 at Olympic, he was 18 years old and he'd already had a career in Spencer Davis. He was on the road when he was like 14, 15 years old. But he's always been a hero of mine. I just think the guy has a phenomenal vocal. And even now, the odd thing that he posts, he's still got this amazing sound, and he's in his, well, I guess he's 70 now, 71.
His last album that he put out back in, I think, 2007, I think even then he was writing songs that were transcendent. There's a song called Fly, which I adore. And I think he worked with a bit with Eric Clapton again on that album. So he had a few lead breaks from Eric. Dirty City, I think the song is. It's just great. It's got that sort of slightly Blind Faith feel, of course, because it's got that partnership there between the two of them. But he's another guy that turns up on albums that I love, doing things. So I mean, this kind of brings us neatly on to
to John.
John. So I love pretty much everything John Martyn did in the 70s. I really like his stuff in the 60s too, but I think once he got to sort of Sunday's Child onwards, obviously Solid Air. Inside Out. Inside Out, and then Solid Air, and then Sunday's Child, and I think then this one. For me, that's a really strong run, and it still has this soul and kind of acoustic depth to it. Perhaps a little bit more electric guitar on this one than there is the acoustic strumming. What I've always loved is the atmosphere on this album, and I was so thrilled to open the book. I think I messaged you straight away and went, "Oh my goodness, you worked on One World," because the sound of the sort of the geese on the lake and the train in the distance and the kind of the water lapping.
Yeah.
I think it was Ralph McTell who said in a documentary on John Martyn that if Small Hours doesn't move you, you're probably not human.
Yeah, it's interesting because Chris Blackwell said it's one of the tracks he's most proud of out of all of the Island roster. But again, it happened really by accident. We were out there with the Island Mobile recording in a barn, and John had a kind of, the barn was really for drums and other things. And then John was in a kind of, we had a converted stable block, and one end had a double story part. So upstairs John was living, and downstairs we turned into the kind of recording room. And there was a guy, I think his name was Hutch, and he was on his way back into London, and he stopped off at Chris's place, which is near Phill. And he just got talking to me, and I knew him, because he was always around Ireland. And he said, "Oh, I've got this fantastic PA system if you want to borrow it." And I went, "Well, we're doing, John acoustic, don't think we'll have much use for it." And he goes, "Well, I'll leave it anyway." So he just unpacked this PA system, and then we just had this idea of like, well, why don't we set it up for a laugh and just blast it across the lake? Because Chris's house is surrounded by a disused gravel pit. And then we'd feed different things into it. So mainly the electric guitar on One World, the solo on that is outdoors. And it has a real surreal kind of sound to it. And then Small Hours is, 4 o'clock in the morning. And 80% of that is just outdoors. And we had a lot, we had trouble. It was summer, but we had, a bit of damp. And again, it was Ireland. We had 87s, which we were using. And when they went down through the damp, we'd just take them off, put another one up, and go and dry them out on the Argo. And we had total disrespect for equipment. And yeah, it's one of my favorites. I mean, the atmosphere on it is fantastic. And it's all it's one take there in the end, because we did loads and loads of takes. And the reason why it starts the way it does is, again, I think it's 16 track, but we used to run a whole reel. So we were working at 15 IPS. So you got 30 minutes. So John would play this for like 30 minutes, various takes. And if we didn't have anything, rather than change the reel and save something we didn't really want, Chris would say, "Okay, back to the top." We'd run it back to the top, and then John would still be playing, and we'd just stick it into record, and and that.
So that sound at the top of the song, pew, pew, pew. What is that sound?
That's just starting the tape machine when he's already playing, so it comes up to speed. But when you hear it back, it's kind of coming down to speed. And it was only happened because the counter was 1 second out. So when you ran 30 minutes back to the top and it said 0, it was actually 1 second in. And then the next time it happened, it would be another second in.
Oh.
So you get that. I know that's how. I mean, I love that style, but it's a complete fluke. It's just. And that third run is the master. So it's, I know when we started it, we must have started it at more like 2:30 in the morning. And then at 4 o'clock, we got that performance. And the geese and ducks, I mean, at one point we had to go out and have a look. This is not on that particular tape, but on a previous one, because of the noise. And we went round on these big kind of columns, a bit like 2001, these big black columns of PA system. And all round the bottom of it are all these geese and ducks, all just it's just, again, completely surreal. And we put mics outside, obviously, and near the water and as far away as we could get from the PA, because I didn't want to just mic up the PA. We were trying to get outdoors.
Yeah.
So as long as our leads would go, we would put an 87. And we had 2 of those kind of in the air, and we had 2 down by the lake. And that's how you get all of that. And the train is it's like the 410 from Paddington to the West Country, I think.
It's alchemy. It's alchemy. I've got the special edition.
Yes.
And there's like an alternative version on there of well, a few of the songs, but of One World. So is that sort of similar? I mean, it's very echoplexy, volume swells, things.
Well, we were doing a lot of, you know, we were there, well, at least a week, if not 10 days of recording. So there'd be lots of different takes and versions of things. So it's probably an alternative from there that they've finished off or put in its basic state.
The interestingly named Black Man at the Shoulder, which is a fantastic groove.
That's a track we put down there, but never, you know, we put down quite a few songs. I mean, it's like this with a lot of records, and that you might record, you know, 14 tracks, but you're only going to use 10 at the end of the day, you know, and you follow things through. And with John, I mean, he jammed a lot and came up with ideas and things. So a lot of the things were just put down. And when, what's his name? Elise Scratch Perry, when he turned up, again, he came to see Chris and then came over to see what we were doing. And John had this guitar pedal called a Big Muff. And Lee had never seen one of those, and he could not believe that you could call a guitar pedal a Big Muff, because to him, a Big Muff means something completely different. So, you know, and he's a pretty kind of off the, you know, crazy kind of guy anyway. So he and John then sat down and wrote Big Muff pretty much on the spot.
Yeah, it's there's no weak track on the album. I mean, Certain Surprise is just delightful. Couldn't Love You More is sort of harking back to his earlier, I think, sound. But One World and Small Hours and Dancing, actually, I love Dancing. It's got that echoplexy space to it, and the layers of sort of echo and the way John's playing.
Brilliant. I mean, he really was so good with all that layering and repeats. And I mean, a fantastic guy. I mean, obviously many personalities, but you know, beautiful writer, and I love his vocals.
I remember the day he died in 2009. I had a gig that night, and I did 3 or 4 of his songs, and felt grief. To be honest, I never met the guy, but he is one of my. I mean, I discovered the sort of I call them the island trinity of sort of British folk, which is probably a little bit for lots of folky people that I know. These guys wouldn't be considered folk; they'd be considered pop. But Nick Drake, Richard Thompson, and John Martyn are sort of like a trinity to me of that rural acoustic sound of the sort of 70s singer-songwriter sound, and I just adore all of them.
But John and Nick Drake had this big argument about a month before Nick Drake died. And John, you know, he's not good in arguments. He has to win, and if not verbally, physically. And it was because Nick Drake had accused him of selling out because John had kind of gone electric and was using effects. And Nick had, you know, and they were the best of friends. That's the weird thing. They were just such good friends. So they had this big argument. And as usual, you know, at the end, John just goes, and never phoned him up to say, sorry, I was totally out of order, which he said to me so many times. I don't know why I was like that, you know. And then Nick died. So when he, you know, he made albums like Solid Air and things like that were about Nick. But he never really quite got over that. I mean, and I saw this documentary back in the mid-2000s of John when he was now living in Ireland, and he was having his leg amputated. And
Johnny Too Bad. Great documentary.
It's desperate, though. I mean, I found it really hard to watch this from this pretty guy back in the 70s. You know, he'd become he looked like Orson Welles. You know, he was like 20 stone, losing his leg, and being very hedonistic, almost for the cameras, you know. And it was just like, John, what has happened to him? And then, you know, then he's dead. I mean, the whole thing was just a nightmare. But I'm so pleased to have worked on that.
There's a scene in that documentary where he's playing Sweet Little Mystery, I think, of Grace and Danger, and he's crying. It's just a rehearsal setup in Glasgow, I think. And the guy making the documentary's there, and the wounds are still so raw inside of John that he's weeping as he's singing this song.
I mean, a lot of people who kind of, you know, met him on a bad day just think of him as being a very aggressive character, you know. But he was definitely, you know, different personalities, and one side of him was just so beautiful and so soft and so gentle and so brilliant. You know, you couldn't write those kind of songs if you didn't have that side to you, you know. And then, you know, whether it's alcohol or whatever, then you'd get the other side of him. I mean, he was a tricky. I mean, I got on well with him. He used to live in the next village to me for a while, and his two children were a bit older than mine. So Vari probably was about 9. And she used to babysit my kids who were kind of, I don't know, 2 and 5 or something, you know. So we were good mates at one point. But even that didn't stop him, you know, attacking me if I didn't agree with certain things. You know, I was very good at being able to kind of deal with him, I think. And as soon as I either talked my way out of things or I kind of went, right, I'll see you later. And I would just like avoid getting into a confrontation, because you don't really win with John, you know.
Right. Amazing. And so I'm gonna move on now to a little bit later. As you said earlier, the 80s was perhaps not certainly the first, you know, half of the 80s weren't massively fruitful for you. You sort of ended your relationship with Ireland at that point.
Yeah, I stopped working for Ireland probably end of the 70s. Really, I did Roxy Music, I think, in '79. The 80s, I just didn't like a lot of the technology that came in. I didn't like computerized mixing, and I thought a lot of the music was just, or the technology more than the music, was just naff. You know, I hated these massive drum sounds and this keyboard brass and all that kind of stuff. And I did work with. You know, I did Party Fears 2 for the Associates, and I had, you know, hits with China Crisis and the band King, you know, so I did have things that I was doing that was successful and that I enjoyed doing. But on the whole, it was the first 4 or 5 years were just grim in a way. I didn't like the way record companies were changing, where you're now dealing with lawyers and accountants and A&R guys. You know, I never met an A&R guy for probably the first 6 years I was in the business, all through Ireland. You know, the A&R guy might be Muff Winwood or Guy Stevens, who were also producers, and they understood the process. You know what I mean? They were making records themselves. And in the 80s, you had all these young A&R guys that didn't really know how you made records. They just thought they could pick a hit, all that rubbish, you know. And then by 86, I mean, I hadn't worked for about 6 months, and I was about to get out of the business, really, because I needed to earn some money. You know, I had kids, wife, house, all the usual things, and I used to sell stuff at a local market. You know, it was tough for about 6 months, and then by chance, you know, I bumped into Tim Freeze Green at Wessex Studios, which led on to it kind of, you know, recreating a career, but also probably doing the album that I'll probably be remembered for, which is The Spirit of Eden. I mean, that seems to be, I mean, I've had so much work, yeah. I mean, it's kind of bizarre. So much work from that in the last 30 years. So I work with young bands from, you know, yeah.
No, sorry, continue. You're working with young bands.
Well, there's a band, Babasonicus, which is an Argentinian kind of pop rock band. They got in touch with me. I went out there twice to Argentina to work with them. And the first time, you know, we were working away, and they were in their kind of mid to late 20s, I suppose, by then. And I go, so what made you ring me up, you know? And I thought it might be, you know, like we've said, Bob Marley or something that people would have heard of. This Spirit of Eden. You know, we listened to it when we were 16 years old, changed our lives, you know. And then I got to work with the Walkabouts in Seattle, Chris Ekman, who I later went on and did a lot of co-production with, Midnight Choir, Norwegian band. You know, I mean, I had this career of unknown records as far as that's concerned, but great records. Midnight Choir, the guy has got such an amazing voice. And it always came down to Spirit of Eden as the reason why they'd got in touch. And now it's bigger than it ever was.
Yeah, I think it will be one of these snowball effect albums that as more time goes on and more successive generations of music aficionados or whatever you want to call them discover this, it's like the ultimate word of mouth, because there are people now who are in huge bands that cite this as a major influence, from Chris Martin and Coldplay to Guy Garvey and Elbow, members of Blur that I've spoken to, big fans of it. Fans almost the wrong word, because it's like, for me, to be quite honest, I could take or leave the first two Talk albums.
Right.
It's My Life, great song.
Yeah, great songs. I mean, there's some great songs on both those albums.
But drenched in these early 80s keyboard sounds that just kind of alienate me from it.
Yeah, now you know what I mean by that early 80s thing. It's like horrible productions, unnecessary use of nasty keyboard sounds. There's some great songs on the first two albums, but I wasn't a massive fan then. The album that got me interested was Colour of Spring.
Absolutely.
I just think that's an amazing record. Great songs, but also a much calmer production. And that's why, I went to the gig of Colour of Spring, a gig in 86, was it, at Hammersmith Odeon, which is what made me go, wow, as my career was going down the toilet, I'm thinking, God, that blew me away, and then when I bumped into Tim by accident at Wessex, and I congratulated, I said, man, that's my album of 86, well done, it's such a brilliant album. That's the kind of band I should be working with, which was a kind of, in a way, what my head was thinking. And then, 3 months later, I get this phone call, were you serious? Come and meet Mark. And then I spent 13 years with Mark.
Yeah. And let's quickly dive into this, because there's a sort of a mystique which, as you already know, I buy into wholeheartedly around, Colour of Spring and Laughing Stock. And I always actually, even though now I've read your book, I understand more of the sort of the nuances and the differences between the Talk records and the solo, Mark Hollis's solo record. I still sort of see these as a progression. And we kind of come off.
Yeah, the trilogy for me, I think, was Colour of Spring, Spirit of Eden, Love Song. Those three work, and you can see the progression through all of them. I think Mark's solo album, it's 6 years or something later, but it's a different kind of beast in a way. It sounds different, the songs are different, in a way. It's all acoustic.
Yes, and I think it's probably because of the way I discovered them myself. So I actually heard this first, and it quickly became this source of huge fascination. So I had to, as quickly as possible, get hold of this, and then I sort of found Colour of Spring later, even after I'd actually found this. So I think I agree with them, because I sort of bought all these very quickly close together. Yes, the mystique around making it. So Tim Free Screen comes on the scene with Talk for Colour of Spring.
He got involved at the end of the second album, whichever one that is.
Oh, right, okay. It's My Life.
Yeah, I think Rhett Davis was technically producing the record at the time. And they brought Tim in at the end to kind of, do some final overdubs and to mix it. And that's when he and Mark got together. Then Colour of Spring is obviously all Tim, and Mark and Tim co-writing. So Tim was through, definitely the three albums, but a little bit on the second.
And a question I asked you on email when I first connected with you was, so you got Mark Hollis and you got Tim Free Screen, and they're very much coming together over these albums. But what do you think are the distinctives between them? Because they're sort of both producing this. How would you describe their sort of synergy?
Yeah, I mean, technically, I suppose, you know, Tim was producing, and Mark, you know, and Tim and Mark had written it. Mark was the performer, but then Tim played as well, you know, so it is very kind of difficult to separate them. Mark, from my point, did a huge amount of, I mean, a lot of his decisions we went with. I mean, I think Tim was a bit like me. You can steer an artist and you can just talk to an artist if you're going the wrong route necessarily, but basically if what's happening is good and it is what the artist wants, why not go with the artist, you know? So Mark often would have the final say, definitely on Laughing Stock. I mean, Laughing Stock should have been a co-production in a sense, because it was Mark's decision on pretty much everything that it was more of what we threw away and what we used, you know, that was very much Mark. So Tim would be there with me, you know, setting things up with the sounds and all the rest of it. But it's very hard to distinguish between those two roles. Tim and Mark were almost one item. They had the same kind of difficult, sarcastic form of humour. They'd written the stuff, you know, between them. So they were the two people in a way. They were the two captains, and everyone else was you know, there to supply a particular function.
Do you think on Spirit of Eden, Paul and Lee felt like members of the band?
They did on Spirit of Eden, yes. I mean, I think because, you know, Paul, I mean, you know, I'm still in touch with Paul and I helped him out with the Rusted Man album, but he described himself towards the end of Spirit of Eden. He said, I'm a bass performer, I'm not a bass player. And the reason why he'd said that was because he had his parts that he would play to the tracks that we were putting together. If Mark said something like, that's great, but can you do a G instead of a D, whatever the musical side of it, Paul would go, okay. He would then have to go away and kind of work that out and practice it. He couldn't just immediately play it like most session bass players can. So it got to a point on Spirit of Eden where he'd pretty much done everything that he could do, and he was the first to say that. You know, it wasn't like he wasn't thrown out. He kind of went, look, I don't have any more to give on this. And that's when we started to bring in other bass players. And then I brought in Simon Edwards because we ran out of people that Tim and Mark knew. And they said, you know, I said, well, there's this guy, Simon Edwards, who I think is brilliant, but, you know. So we brought him in and he worked perfectly and also is the main bass player for the whole of Laughing Stock. But at the end of Spirit of Eden, Paul left the band. It was his decision. But Lee was very, you know, they were part of the band at that point, and they'd turn up and be on the session. Paul less and less, because I mean, it's a long time, you know, 11 months or whatever. But Lee would nearly always turn up, even when his drum tracks had been done months ago. He would always, you know, be there to put in his, you know, fourpennyworth and to hear how things were going. Laughing.
That's good to hear, because I think, you know, it's almost easy to sort of see these last two Talk albums as Mark Hollis, Tim Freese-Green, and others, you know, guests. But it's got Talk written on it, so you want to hope that other members of the band who had been, you know, playing on those early albums were still having the chance to input into the music.
Definitely Spirit of Eden, you know, I say Lee was there. It all changed on Laughing Stock, but on Spirit of Eden, it was a Talk record, you know.
Of course, they went on to make O-Rang, didn't they, as a partnership?
Yeah. Yeah, Lee, Paul and I, we built a little studio in Tottenham Hale called The Slug, and I helped them out for about 3 months and went off to do it, and they did O-Rang. And Paul, when I met up for that, Paul had all these demos of songs that he'd put down in his own home studio in his house. And the idea was to get, you know, we all pulled our equipment and built the studio, but the idea was to record a lot of those songs. And then because of, you know, the effect on all of us of doing Spirit of Eden and Laughing Stock was so strong and intense that nothing was ever quite the same again. And this thing of being spontaneous and just throwing things at the wall and seeing what you wanted to keep it all got into our psyche. So when we set up the Orang Studios, instead of us immediately doing Paul's songs, it was like, well, let's just, I'll set the drums up, we'll set the bass up, and let's just do something, not a song. And then Orang came out of that. We started getting things that we liked. So all Paul's songs were just put aside, and we went for the Orang album. And it became very much Paul's project, Lee's project in a sense as well.
It's very percussive, isn't it? There's lots of all sorts of world music instruments, clanging and banging and sort of grooving along. But it's for me, listening to it, it's sort of as a sort of parallel to what Mark went on to do. You can hear the elements beginning to split. What made Laughingstock and Spirit of Eden sort of so singular as a kind of a listening experience, the elements of that you can sort of hear more distinctively in these other pieces of work that came.
Yeah.
And I use the word singular, even though there's two albums, which obviously for yourself being there, you will know better than anybody the differences in how those two records were made. But there were similarities, weren't there, in terms of the studio and the light shows and things and the kind of intensity.
They were made very similar. We just, in a way, when we went back in for Laughingstock, we picked up where we left off with Spirit of Eden as far as, like you say, the lighting. But we didn't want to repeat ourselves miking wise, so that's why we just decided to use one mic on the drums instead of the Neumann head and the contact mics that we'd used for Spirit of Eden. And we started to record things from a much further distance as well. Nothing was ever mic close. It was all 6 feet away, 4 feet away. The drums 28 feet away.
28 feet.
Which caused major problems with delay, which we hadn't, Tim and I, neither of us had taken that into account. So we had to put up close mics to feed Lee and to feed anyone that was playing with him. But we weren't recording any of those. And we had our mic, this 47 that was 28 feet away, which had it varied between 22, 28 millisecond delay, depending on the temperature in the room. And no one was hearing that, obviously, because it was late. So it was one of the first times in my life when I've recorded what we're hearing in the control room is completely different to what everyone else is hearing in the room. Because usually you try to, I've always had this thing of trying to get everyone in the same space. So, your headphone mixes, balances, everything. It just makes everyone lock into the same world. This was the exact opposite of that. But we approached it very similar, I suppose, in the fact that it was all spontaneous. We had no tracks or anything to work with. We just had Lee's 6 drum patterns, or 7, I think we had. We didn't get the Swabi track. That was used for Orang in the end. But we just record drums. That was the start of the album, and then bring in Martyn Ditcham to do some percussion and slowly build the thing up.
Yeah. As you know, I'm absolutely fascinated by the whole approach to recording. Even from, you worked with Glyn Johns in the 60s, and you sort of talk about the much more stripped back way of miking a kit sort of thing. Yeah. Were you sort of working from a Glyn Johns technique, as they call it, thing?
No, because Glyn used kind of 3 or 4 mics. He didn't always use that classic Glyn, what's become called the classic Glyn Johns miking thing. He didn't always just have those 3 mics. But back in those days, because the desks were very limited, with Keith Grant, we did the Dusty Springfield album, 50-piece orchestra with a rhythm section, strings, the lot, coming through a 12-channel desk or something, so the drums is a bass drum and an overhead. You didn't have all these other mics. That's something else that happened in the 80s, where you mic'd up everything.
Yeah.
So we just didn't want to repeat ourselves, and we loved, Lee's very heavily into Can and the kind of jazz thing, and obviously Mark was heavily into the jazz thing. So we just kind of thought that one mic in the room would give us a different kind of vibe, that wouldn't be Spirit of Eden, and it wouldn't be rock and roll. So we just, I mean, Laughing Stock is a tricky album for me. I mean, it is the bare bones to me of an album. You know, we erased 90% or even more than that of everything we recorded, and just kept stripping everything down all the time.
Wow.
So having one mic on the drums seemed to make sense at the time.
I think it still does, and it's so hard for me to describe it, because I think the whole point of this music is to transcend description in many ways. I think being sort of member of the forums and things on Facebook that discuss this work, you can get a real impression of just how sacred this work, or both Spirit of Eden and Laughing Stock, are to people, because all of those hours, and there must, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours, it was worth it.
Yeah, no, I think that, which is what I mean. I think after Spirit of Eden, you know, when my wife said to me, you know, if you ever work with that band again, you move out, which is first time she's ever said anything about anything I've ever worked on. And I'd been working for, you know, at least 20 years, I suppose, at that point. We'd been together for about 14. And I still went back and worked with him on Laughing Stock, because there's nothing quite like the experience of those records, you know. I mean, we were proud of what we'd done. I didn't know if it was good. I mean, I've read that Tim thought it would sell 4 million. I had no idea. But then, because of all the grief we had from EMI and the fact that it was a failure, to go in and do Laughing Stock, you know, I had no preconceived ideas. I was just willing to go back, and the fact that I was asked isn't always nice, you know. And I think Mark trusted me at that point, which is why I ended up just being him and I on his third album, you know. So yeah, I think it was worth it for all the brain cells and the chaos it caused. I mean, Laughing Stock, you know, there were divorces, there were breakdowns, there was so much chaos at the end of the record.
You say divorces and things, and then I think, oh, that's so extreme. Like, was it worth it for the breakdown of a marriage?
Well, it was. Fortunately, mine survived, so I can say it was worth it.
I mean, obviously, there's other factors involved when relationships fail. It's probably not just.
Oh yeah, no, it's not just definitely one particular thing, but I mean, I think that the breakdowns definitely were to do with that album.
Yeah,
and
right.
My assistant on Laughing Stock was a young kid. He was 18 years old. He'd only been at Wessex for a few months, and he hadn't really done that many sessions. And they kept saying, "Oh, Phil's coming in with Talk, you know, you're going to be doing that session." And then he stepped into this world which he probably wasn't expecting. I don't think I would have dealt with it too well if I'd been 18, 19 years old. You know, it was only because I'd been through things like, you know, the Stomy and Mashter sessions, or working with John Martyn even, you know what I mean, where you could take things that were off the wall and not the norm and deal with it. You know, I was 31, I guess, by the time I did Laughing Stock. But it affected the assistant desperately hard. He stuck with it, but he was a bit of a wreck at the end of it. The first assistant, Sean, who was brilliant through Spirit of Eden, he was like my shadow. He was writing everything down. He resigned, you know, a week after the album was finished. He left the business. He says it's not because of that album. He'd planned to do that anyway, which is fair enough. But, you know, because we had to do these recalls, you see, what's hard to understand is that although it was all very spontaneous and all, you know, we would spend hours or days setting up a sound, getting it right in the room. Might take 2 days, you know, definitely guitar sound. I remember spending 5 days on a guitar sound, you know, and 2 or 3 of those, and that's 12 hours a day, you know, and you get the guitar sound set up, and then you've put up various mics, and then you've got to decide which mic, you know, and all of this takes a lot of time. But Sean and Stuart, but they would write, we had to write down everything. So it was the serial number of the mic, not just A87, it was the exact 87. And take 3 measurements from 3 different places so that we knew this is exactly where it was, you know. And the reason for that is that Mark would come in, you know, this is a long period of time, but he might come in 2 months after we've done the piano and say, I just want to add 1 note.
Oh, man.
And you've got to get back to something. That's why we took the temperature of the room, the humidity of the room, all of that was so that we could get the conditions exactly back, so that it all felt real and natural and was happening at the time. I mean, for me, those albums are successful for me personally because it sounds real and it sounds like 5 guys in a room making a record, but it's all an illusion, and that's what's so remarkable.
But even when, like myself, now I know that it's an illusion, it doesn't lose any of its magic for me.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you know, as I find out more about the process in which it was made, it just gives me more and more respect for everyone involved because of the relentless pursuit of excellence that all of you must have had to achieve.
We were there living it, you know, in the dark, each day, you know, same lighting, and just living that world, which is why probably we were very difficult for everyone else to live with.
It's almost like, for me, like, you know, stories of, you know, my grandpa who served in the Korean War, and, you know, these experiences that people have, and almost impossible to relay to somebody that wasn't there. I mean, we've got the document, unlike, you know, grandpa in Korea doesn't come back with an album. We have an album to listen to, and we have, you know, I've got the much coveted, now quite valuable Missing Pieces disc, with the sort of outtakes on it, and a few extra bits and pieces. And I think one of the questions that my friend James Lewis, who I talk at length about these things with, the inevitable question is, well, we've got Missing Pieces, but is there anything else that will ever see the light of day?
Well, it's tricky. I mean, I can't see there will be from Laughing Stock because we erased anything that wasn't used. Like, you know, things were erased, and then what was left is what you hear. So we don't have any hidden songs that we never finished. You know, is that Missing Pieces? Is it Pond Life? Is that the right?
Yeah, that's the Pond Life one. Yeah,
there's a slight problem with all of that because that's the manager, Keith Aspen, who somehow got hold of, must have bought the masters or whatever, or did a leasing deal from EMI, and put out that record. Now, I would imagine Mark wouldn't have been that happy because he hated this remix world and you know, people taking something of his and making it into something else. That really used to annoy Mark. You know, that's why he hated the album they did out of Colour of Spring, the History Revisited or whatever it was called. But and that was for EMI to try and recoup some of their money because of the failure of Spirit of Eden. Mark always hated that thing. And I mean, I got into trouble a couple of times on Facebook, like you say, on these, you know, these sites where people are it's almost a religion.
Yeah.
Somebody's posted up there a terrible version of I Believe in You, where they've taken his song, they haven't even redone it. They've taken the original master and then overdubbed like techno drums to it. And I actually said, you know, what a load of garbage. And, you know, off it explodes. You know what Facebook's like. A lot of people that agreed with me, but some people just basically having a go at me because, you know, I didn't like somebody being artistically, you know, trying to recreate something. I said, well, if they were recreating it, fair enough. But to take somebody's record and stick something on top of it is not a remix, you know, in my mind anyway. But so I'm not 100% behind the Missing Pieces and all these things that sneak out. I mean, somebody's now released the multi-tracks, it seems, because, you know, people keep saying, oh, I listen to Mark's voice now on its own. Well, that can only happen if you've got hold of the original multi-track. So whether it's EMI, Polydor, Keith, I have no idea. But I don't agree with it because I'm trying to stick to Mark's philosophy of, you know, this is my album. Everything else, it doesn't matter, you know. Which is why part of the reason we erased so much stuff, it was because we had to you know, end up with what we required, but it was also so there wasn't all this material there for somebody to come in and remix it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's purely out of curiosity and sort of a desperation to to explore everything that anyone can possibly explore to do with this body of work.
Yeah.
There's such a
limited, yeah. There's a limited list of stuff since Colour of Spring. There's very little apart from the 3 albums. You know, there aren't a lot of outtakes. We've got a few B-sides and a few experimental things we did, which have come out, but there's very little else as far as I know. I mean, I don't remember a whole wealth of other tracks.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the solo album comes along in 1998. After, if I remember rightly from the book, a bit of a sort of false start.
Yeah, well, the thing is, it was tricky. I mean, I guess I didn't really want to go through another experience of a Talk record at that point, I suppose. I mean, it turned out it was a very difficult experience, but I didn't want to do that. But I agreed with Mark that I would set it all up. So we got the band together, which was all acoustic instruments. And we booked Air Studios, and we went into Air Studio 2 and set everybody up. It was just with using 2 mics. So it was very important that the room was right, you know, the sound of the room was right. And we did a bunch of recordings at Air, checking the room, didn't like it because we thought it was too live. Then we went to, I think, Lansdowne, saying, you know, brought the guys back in. And this was woodwind section and, you know, percussionist, guitar. And we thought that was too dead. And then we ended up at Master Rock. So I spent, you know, 2 or 3 days, apart from the days at Air and the other place, I spent a couple of days setting it up because we were just using these 2 mics and then bringing everyone in, putting them in the room where we wanted them on the stereo. So we would, you know, move people slightly more left or further back. So we got a balance that we wanted. And then we marked the floor with their name and their instrument. And then I kind of went, right, I'll leave you to it, because the whole process was there. And Mark he loves control, so he wanted to record everything individual. So rather than bring in the kind of, I know, probably 20-piece band, he wanted to do everyone individual. So we marked everything, set it all up, and then I left. And then I guess, I mean, 2 or 3 months passed, and he phoned me up one day, and he just had these weird questions. I was immediately suspicious, but he said things like, if something's too bright, can it be dulled down? It's like, right. And if something's too near, can it be made further back, you know? And I said, well, I'd have to hear what you're talking about. You know, he said, well, come up to the house. So I went up to Winwood, he was living at the time, and he played me what he had. And I said, this is not what I set up. You know, I could tell that this was not just 2 mics at the front of the room. And I said, so is this really what we set up? You know, hang on, I'll phone. And he phoned whoever, I can't remember his name right now, but the guy that was producing it originally. And came back and said, well, it is, but there are other mics as well. And I said, okay, so are those other mics mixed into the stereos, or are they just sitting on tracks? I'll go and ring him, you know. So these weird conversations, and eventually came back very, very down and said they're all mixed into the stereos. So what they'd done is take my 2 mics at the front of the room, but then put a spot mic on whatever instrument they were doing. And I can see why they might have done it, because the grief that we had over with EMI and Polydor over those records, the hatred that the record companies had, I think this guy was thinking, I can see this all going wrong. I'm going to at least make it sound a bit more acceptable. So he'd recorded things closely, used compression, which was not part of the equation, and then mixed it into the stereo pair in its position in the stereo, but a close mic. So when Mark found out, I mean, he was furious, but he sacked the guy and said, would I go in and work with him on it? So I basically did go in and spent 6 months making the record with him. And we did it as we originally intended, which was just 2 mics, head height when you're sitting in a chair, and everybody in the room in front of you. Because the idea was to make it feel as if you were in the room.
It's incredibly beautiful and intimate, and it makes me want to cry. I mean, A Life is probably the one that And the opening track, Colour of Spring, gets me going straight away. But A Life in particular, it's something else, man. Something else.
When it starts with the creaking chair and things, I mean, that is a great track. But I mean, none of that was set up. It was just that, you know, when you got two mics, any sound in the room, you're going to hear it. They're wide open, you know. And Mark was just like, it was actually his chair. One seems to think it's his guitar neck, but it was just his chair. And he and Dominic Miller were, you know, sitting next to each other. And then everyone was panned out in our original setting. And then when we came to do vocals, I remember saying to Mark, so should we now put up just one mic for the vocals? Or do you want to stay with the stereo, you know, as we've got it? He said, no, we've got to stay with what we've got, and I have to be in the same position. So he's actually slightly off center, and he has this tendency to kind of move his head to the left when he's singing. So if you hear it on headphones, you can see him or hear him kind of moving to the right.
Yeah. It's amazing. And there's an album, I don't know if you've ever heard, called Hope by a guy called Foy Vance.
No.
And it's recorded in a cottage in Ireland, I think. He's from Northern Ireland. And it's just him and a piano player in a room. And it's almost like you can tell what's in the room. It's like sonar, because the room sound is so part of the sonic. It's just like you're in the room. There's chairs creaking. There's kind of the sound of a bird outside the window, or the piano stool, or whatever. And I absolutely adore that level of atmosphere. But my brother, also into music and a musician, he's not into that at all. He's like, oh, it's a bit too roomy.
Right.
And he likes a bit of room effect on maybe a guitar solo or something, where you can sort of hear the distance from the mic to the amp. But something so live and so roomy, he's not so into. And I think it's really interesting who loves that and who isn't so keen.
I think that's why it was so important, the room that we were in. You know, if we'd done it at Air 2, it would have just been too roomy, you know. And then if we'd been at Lansdowne, it would have just felt too dead and too kind of, you know, not the effect we wanted. So all we were doing then, we weren't interested in even the equipment. What we were interested in was the sound of the room. So that's, why it ended up being Master Rock. We happened to have this prototype Focusrite desk, which was beautiful, but it was 80 channels, I think, or 72 channels, and we had 2. That's all we were using with these 2 mics. And we did it the same way, you know, we did it to tape and with a Mitsubishi 32 track. So we went through a lot of reels on that as well.
And you went from there, and that's sort of, there's one band I wanted to talk to you about, I forgot about, which was the Third World War. Because that's sort of, that album, that first album is still so fresh. That must have been I mean, we're talking about like 1970, 71, aren't we?
70, 71, yeah. It was 70. It was the very first session I did for Ireland when I joined. So I joined in June. I was on sessions helping Frank Owen and various people for a week or two, so I could get my head around the setup at the studio and get used to the new Helios desk and all of that kind of thing. And then John Fenton came in for my first project, Third World War, and it was anarchy. I mean, he refused to have screens, you know, and that was, again, it's like, really? There'll be no separation, don't want separation. You know, he was just an anarchist. And,
did you mix it?
Yeah, I did the whole album, the first one. I mean, actually, about 5 or 6 years ago now, we got the tapes and remixed the album, because the one thing that I always thought was you know, rushed or wasn't as good as it could be were the mixes, you know. So we got hold of the tapes and remixed it at the Dairy through a Neve and made it just feel and sound better. I mean, feel like it should. We didn't do any tricks. We didn't stick it in Pro Tools or anything. We just mixed it as it was, but better. I mean, I was, you know, 20 years old. I was 19 when I did that. But unfortunately, there's a whole legal thing going on with who owns the tapes, you know, one of those. So it'll probably never see the light of day. And then John died a couple of years ago. But no, it was anarchy and great fun to do. And the lyric, I mean, it was like the first punk band, but in 1970.
Well, yeah, it's 6 years or so before punk explodes, and it just sounds amazing. And I was listening earlier to a 2015 remaster.
Really?
Yes, it's on Spotify, and there's a Third World War II 2001 remaster, both up on Spotify. So
know anything about that?
someone has remastered it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing, I mean, going back to Mark, but I never knew this, but it was one of his, that first album was one of his favourite albums. And he came in one day and gave me this, his copy of Third World War, because Ascension Day goes, that is a classic. I often wondered why he called one of his songs Ascension Day, whether he'd planned that anyway, but it was all around the same time of giving me this record.
Phil, do you know what today is?
Ascension Day.
It is. I love that. It is. It actually is Ascension Day today. I work for the Church of England, so I had a think.
Yeah, I thought it might be.
Yeah. So the career that you had sort of post 90s, should we say? I mean, you worked with Dido. You cover that in the book.
Yeah.
Not the happiest of working experiences.
The first album was great fun, actually. I mean, I loved working on the first album. It was done really fast, and she's lovely, and I enjoyed the first album. I still think it's a really cool little album, very English, good humour. Second album, she sold 12 million records on the first album. And of course then, she had no record company, no manager when we did the first album. But by the time we did the second album, which was about 3 years later, she's got A&R guys, she had 3. A manager and assistants, and it was a whole different world, and I hated it. And where the first album had taken like 6 weeks, the second album took almost a year. I was not every day. They brought me in for doing kind of real instruments, and then other people would do the techno stuff. But it wasn't fun. And then it was partly the way I guess I was treated, in the sense of she was a friend. I knew her 3 years before we did her first album, because I was working with Faithless, and she'd pop down from her day job in the evenings, and then she'd phone up, she's in LA or in some American studio, and they don't seem to get my vocal sound, and we didn't do anything special, so I'd tell her what we used, and that she did that 2 or 3 times, and I don't mind that. I'll tell anyone what I use, because it's never the same for me when I set it up, so I have no problem with giving away the information. But then it suddenly changed, and it was her manager that was phoning up saying, look, Dido's in the studio, she can't get a vocal sound, And that kind of pissed me off, I suppose, in the sense of like, here we go, it's this music thing. But I did enjoy working with her. I mean, I think the first 2 albums, by far the best. I mean, not because I did them, I just think that's when it was at its peak. She's had 5 or 6 albums out, and, the 3rd or 4th one is quite embarrassing as a record, I think. My son had it and played it to me. I went, you're kidding, what has happened here, But it's very hard if you make 2 records and you sell 24 million copies, you've got a hell of a lot to live up to. I mean, if I'd been Dido, I would have taken that 24 million quid and I would have got on with my life, and I would have made experimental music or do whatever you want to do. But I would not have kept trying to chase another hit. And because of all the people around her, this business sucks the life out of everyone. She was always trying to have another thank you or another white flag and all of that. I haven't seen her for years, but I did see Rollo about 3 years ago. Strangely, I was up in Norfolk with my wife. We were walking the coastal path, and there's this guy and a woman walking towards her with a dog, and gets 20 feet away and goes, Phil. And it's Rollo. I mean, of all the places you're going to meet Rollo is on the north coastal path. He says, I live down the road. I'm just out for a walk, So, we had a good old chat. So I don't have any bad feelings towards that camp. I did ask for, a 0.25%, because we didn't get paid that well on the first album, because it was a favour for Rollo. And everyone kind of went, oh, we can't possibly give you a percentage, which I think is so in contrast to people like Robert Palmer, who gave me 1% without me asking, because he said, you're part of the team. Well, I think with Rollo and Dido, it was very much keep it all in-house, you know, and pay people, but it's not a team. And I love working with Faithless. You know, I worked with Maxi just a few years back now. We did an album. And he went through a lot of the same grief I went through with, you know, Rollo and the whole management company. He went through as well, which I find remarkable, considering he was, for me, Faithless, you know. But they didn't treat him particularly well. It's that kind of business. You know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's been an absolute joy to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. I'll plug this again, because there's you know, you've recorded Pink Floyd. There's so much more in this book about your adventures. It's funny, it's warm, it's vivid, it's really, really well written. I just think anyone who's remotely interested in rock and roll should pick this up. I've got Glyn John's book, which is, I've ordered it since reading this, because I think it's one thing to read but I've got books by, you know, I've got Mike Scott's book, Bono, Nick Drake, Blur, various people from music. But actually, they're from the performer's perspective, that's quite interesting. But being there throughout all these different artists' recording experiences is a whole new genre almost to me. So I'm really excited to read Glyn's book as well. I've got a couple of quick questions. One is, who would you have worked with, given the choice? Anybody that could have been, you know, realistic in the last 50, 60 years of popular music?
I think, I mean, for a long time in the 70s, I wanted to work with John Lennon. When the years when he disappeared, I remember saying in the interview back then, but when he disappeared and wasn't, you know, living in New York as a house husband, and I'd love to have worked with him then, which probably would have been his the album that he brought out in 1980, just before his death. I would love to have worked with him, or Julian Lennon even, because I think he's fantastic as well. But I'd like to have worked with John. I don't know if there's that many other people that I missed out on, as it were. I was thinking I was pretty lucky. I'd love to work with Midnight Choir again. I mean, they broke up like the bands do, and they haven't made a record for 10 or 12 years, but they're pretty special. But no, I don't have a big list of people that I would love to have worked with, because I kind of got to work with some. I mean, Joni Mitchell, you know, another hero of mine, managed to work with her. So yeah, I've got no regrets on that.
Another question is about equipment. Do you have pieces of equipment that you've kept for sentimental reasons that you have, that you can sort of look at and hold in your hand, or anything like a tape machine or a microphone or anything like that from your recording?
No, I did have an Akg D12, which was a massive favourite of mine, which I had for 40 odd years, until it unfortunately got to the point where it was unmendable, which was from the Island days, and I used to use it on bass drum all the time. The only mic I've had stuff in the past, I had two Revoxes and all kinds of stuff like that. Got rid of it, most of it. The only thing I still have is a Sony C48 microphone, which you can put a battery in and take out into the field. But it's all over. It's a brilliant room mic, percussion mic. We used it on Talk Talk. I've used it since about 1982 when I bought it. I still love it. And I haven't got rid of it yet. But no, I haven't kept any gems.
And my last question is, do you keep up to date with with modern music? And is there an artist or a band that has grabbed you and you thought, love to work with those guys?
I don't really listen to a vast amount of music, I must admit, of modern music anymore. I mean, I just, it's how you get hold of it, isn't it? Like you were saying with the internet stuff, there's so much out there now that it's through recommendations, you know, people that say to you, hey, if you check this band out. The two bands in this country that I love is Dreadzone, which has been going for quite a long time, and a band called Show of Hands, which is from the West Country.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're really amazing songs. And both of those bands, at certain points in the last 15 years, I've kind of gone, wow, I'd love to work with those guys. But then I listen to their records and actually go, I love what they do. I'm not sure what I could add, you know what I mean, because of what they do. So no, there's no modern bands that I can think of that I want to work with. Those two I would have at certain points gone, well, I'd love to work with show bands, you know. And I go and see Dreadzone live all the time. And it's another band that for a while I was like, wow, I'd love to work with those guys. And then I kind of go, but what would I do? You know, what can I bring to something that is already so bloody good, you know? So no, I've retired. I did an album with mythical about a year ago, his new record, which should have come out, but because of, you know, all of this, I guess it's delayed. And I did some mixes a few weeks ago for the Bombay Bicycle Club, you know. So I do the yeah. Well, I love their acoustic stuff. I did the Floors album. So there's the odd artist that I still love and would work with, but I'm, you know, 99%. I'm just not interested.
Now I know Bombay Bicycle Club are young, but they're very, very into music history and into all sorts of heritage stuff. And I actually know that, this is a bit geeky, but one of them, their dad played for David Gilmour.
Their dad is Neil McCall, who played with, well, I mean, so many people. David Gray. He played on Beth Gibbons' album that Paul produced. Yeah, and definitely with Gilmour. I recorded a Gilmour concert in London about 10, 12 years ago or something, and Neil McCall was the other guitarist.
Was that the Royal Festival Hall one?
Yeah.
I was there.
Ah, well, there you go. Another little connection. But yeah, we recorded a beautiful DVD that came out of that.
Oh. I got into Richard Thompson off the back of that because they covered Dimming of the Day.
Yeah.
And I was about 18 when I went to it. It was 2001 or 2.
Oh, right. I'm bad on time.
And I loved it. That song just, he said, this is nothing to do with me. I just like it. And did Dimming of the Day. And I thought, that is beautiful.
That was great, wasn't it? I mean, all acoustic. Sam Brown and the choir, you know, that was a great.
Yeah, another friend. Yeah.
And it cost a lot as well, because he rehearsed for weeks, and we had the whole mobile out at some church hall place down there where he lives, and you know, it was all done so meticulously, as Floyd are like an army when they bring those guys in. And then he does one night. I would have done Paris, you know, I'd have added a few on just because of taking a chance on one night's recording. But no, it's a beautiful DVD.
It is. Yeah, I treasure I think it's the first DVD I ever bought.
Yeah. That's Neil McCall, who's the father of one of the guys in the band. Yeah.
So did they come to you, Bombay Bicycle Club?
They did years ago for the Floors album, about, it's probably 15 years ago, but I mean at least 10. When they wanted this Floors album mix, which is their acoustic one. So I mixed, and again, you know, no budget, all the rest of it. So we mixed the whole album in about 4 or 5 days. And it went on one of their biggest albums, you know, got into the top 10. And I love that album. And I really like Jack. I like his writing. And then they brought me in about, 3 or 4 years ago to mix some stuff. And then I got a call a month ago to say, would I be up for mixing 4 tracks? But I had to do it on my own, you know. Up to that point, I've always worked having Jack there because I like the artist around, you know. I'm not one of those guys that doesn't want the artist there. And we had to mix and then send stuff off to London for, you know, the band and manager and everyone to listen to, and then come back with comments. So it wasn't one of the easiest ways of mixing, but we did mix the 4, and they seem happy, and I guess it will come out at some point. But
if you can choose anywhere to mix, where do you like to go to mix?
Well, it depends for what it is. I mean, I mixed at Echo Zoo in Eastbourne because they've got an old Trident TSM that used to belong to Tony Visconti and Bowie. And it has a particular sound to it, those old Tridents, so I love that. My other favourite is, I think it's now called the Red Room. It used to be called the, I don't know, but it's one of the Moloko studios in off the Old Kent Road. And they had Neves, they've now got SSL, but I love that room. Great monitoring, great real outboard gear. I'm not into plugins and all that kind of stuff. So I like that room. I like somewhere that has actually is a bit funky and has a vibe to it. I'm not a big fan of Ayr or Abbey Road. It's all too corporate. So they may have great gear and all the rest of it, but I never feel relaxed in those kind of places. So yeah, the engine room is what it used to be called. Now I think it's called the Red Room. And we mixed the floor. I've mixed a lot of stuff there over the years, including Maxi Jazz's album from a few years ago. So they're my two favourites, and it depends what you want. If you need a bit of automation and a lot of outboard gear, Moloko, and then if you can do it on a TSM manually with some very nice but less outboard gear and some tape machines, then Echo Zoo in Eastbourne.
See, I could talk to you all day. I'll be quiet now.
Okay, well, thanks very much for getting me involved, and all the best with it. And, yeah, let us know when it's on.
Yeah, I tend to be fairly quick because I don't like to edit stuff too much. So yeah, I'll press stop recording now. So I'll say goodbye to everyone watching. Thanks for watching. Thank you so much, Phill, for all your time and all the joy that you've brought to people like me over the years with the music you've made.
Thank you. Cheers. See you later.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thanks.